The morning of June 4th, 1942, 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, northeast of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon through the plexiglass of his B-17 Flying Fortress. Below him, spread across miles of open water, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier striking force steamed toward what they believed would be another decisive victory. Behind Sweeney, 11 more fortresses, from the 5th and 11th, bombardment groups maintained their spacing, each aircraft a 30-ton flying machine bristling with defensive armament. What none of the Japanese fighter pilots preparing to intercept these bombers yet understood was that they were about to encounter a level of concentrated defensive firepower unlike anything they had faced before. The B-17E carried 9 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The Japanese fighters ascending to meet them had been designed to fight opponents armed with rifle-caliber weapons and light machine guns. This fundamental mismatch in firepower would create a psychological shock that would ripple through Japanese fighter squadrons for the remainder of the war in the Pacific. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. A single B-17E Flying Fortress carried approximately 6,000 pounds of armor plating, protecting critical crew positions and fuel systems, 9 50 caliber heavy machine guns positioned to cover every approach angle, and 7,500 rounds of ammunition feeding those weapons. Each 50 caliber Browning M2 weighed 64 pounds, measured 57 inches long, and fired 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet. When a formation of 12 B-17 seconds flew together, an attacking Japanese fighter pilot found himself facing 108 heavy machine guns, all capable of sustained fire at ranges that exceeded his own weapons. The Japanese Navy's premier fighter, the Mitsubishi, a 6M0, carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The Zero's machine guns were effective against unarmored targets, but lacked the range and hitting power of the American 50 caliber weapons. The 20mm cannons were devastating when they connected, but carried only 60 rounds per gun, providing just 8 seconds of firing time before ammunition exhaustion. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how Japanese fighter pilots came to face this unprecedented defensive firepower begins not at Midway, but 9 months earlier, on the morning of December 7th, 1941. At 7:55 that Sunday morning, as the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, a formation of 6 B-17 seconds appeared over Oahu, arriving from Hamilton Field in California en route to reinforce the Philippines. These unarmed bombers, flying with their guns stowed and crews exhausted from the 14-hour flight, found themselves caught in the midst of the Japanese attack. Zero fighters attempting to intercept these unexpected arrivals discovered something remarkable. Even without operational defensive armament, the B-17's size, structural strength, and ability to absorb battle damage made it extraordinarily difficult to bring down. Several fortresses were hit repeatedly by Zero cannon fire and machine guns, yet all landed safely despite damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. This first encounter established a pattern that would define Japanese fighter pilot experiences with the B-17 throughout 1942. On December 8th, when Japanese forces struck Clark Field in the Philippines, they destroyed or damaged most of the 35 B-17 seconds stationed there on the ground. But in the weeks that followed, as surviving fortresses conducted desperate operations against the Japanese advance, Zero pilots found the bomber frustratingly resistant to their attacks. The B-17C and D models operating in the Philippines carried only 6 or 7 defensive guns, including some inadequate 30 caliber weapons in the nose. Yet their robust construction and ability to sustain damage created a psychological impression that exceeded their actual defensive capability. Japanese pilots began developing tremendous respect for what they called the four-engine fighters. Recognizing that destroying a fortress required sustained, accurate fire from multiple attacking aircraft, by January 1942, as American forces retreated through the Netherlands, East Indies to Australia, Japanese intelligence had begun studying captured B-17 wreckage at Clark Field. Engineers from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Services Aviation Technical Research Institute carefully documented every system, every structural detail, every technological feature. What they discovered both impressed and concerned them. The Boeing B-17 represented a completely different philosophy of bomber design than anything produced by Japanese industry. Where Japanese bombers emphasized range and speed by minimizing weight, accepting vulnerability as the price of performance, the American Flying Fortress embraced weight as protection. The B-17D weighed 32,000 pounds empty, nearly double the weight of a comparable Japanese bomber. That weight provided structural strength, armor protection, and the mass necessary to mount heavy defensive armament. The stressed skin aluminum construction gave the aircraft legendary toughness. Japanese engineers measuring fuselage skin thickness found it substantially heavier than their own aircraft. Rivet patterns and joining techniques were designed for strength rather than minimum weight. The power plant arrangement particularly impressed the evaluators. 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, mounted in nacelles that could be jettisoned if damaged by fire. Each engine drove a Hamilton standard constant-speed propeller that automatically maintained optimal blade angle. Turbo superchargers allowed the engines to maintain power at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, where Japanese fighters struggled to operate effectively. The fuel system incorporated self-sealing tanks that could absorb bullet strikes without catastrophic fire. Japanese aircraft of 1941 and early 1942 lacked this protection entirely. A single bullet through an unprotected fuel tank would often result in immediate conflagration. The Americans had traded performance for survivability, accepting lower speed and reduced range in exchange for the ability to bring crews home alive. But what truly distinguished the B-17 from Japanese expectations was its defensive armament philosophy. By February 1942, when Japanese engineers at Clark Field pieced together a flyable B-17D from salvaged components, they understood they were examining a fundamentally different approach to air combat. The B-17E, which began arriving in the Pacific Theater in early 1942, represented a massive increase in defensive capability over earlier models. The most significant change was the addition of a tail gunner position with 250 caliber machine guns. Earlier B-17 models had been nearly defenseless from rear attacks, a vulnerability Japanese pilots had exploited ruthlessly. The E model eliminated this weakness entirely. A dedicated tail gunner sat in a separate compartment at the extreme rear of the fuselage, operating a pair of heavy machine guns with excellent fields of fire covering the entire rear hemisphere. Additional guns were positioned throughout the aircraft. A powered turret in the dorsal position behind the cockpit held 2 more 50 caliber weapons. The revolutionary Sperry Ball turret, suspended beneath the fuselage, provided 2 more guns with 360-degree rotation capability. Waist gunners on each side of the rear fuselage operated flexible 50 caliber guns. A radio operator's gun covered attacks from above and behind. Even the nose, though still the weakest defensive position, now mounted multiple guns for forward defense. The physical demands on B-17 gunners operating these weapons at altitude were extraordinary and must be acknowledged honestly. The ball turret gunner, typically the smallest crew member, entered his position through a hatch in the fuselage floor, then spent the entire mission crouched in a fetal position in a space measuring approximately 4 feet in diameter. He wore no parachute due to space constraints. If the aircraft was hit and going down, he had to rotate his turret to align the hatch with the fuselage opening, exit into the aircraft, retrieve his parachute, and then bail out, all while the bomber was potentially spinning or on fire. The waist gunners stood at open windows where temperatures at altitude reached 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and wind speeds of 150 miles per hour roared through the fuselage. They wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. Spent brass shell casings accumulated on the floor, creating a dangerous slip hazard in the cramped fuselage. The noise was overwhelming, even through protective gear. Yet these men learned to operate their weapons with remarkable effectiveness, despite conditions that would seem to make accurate gunnery impossible. The Browning M2 was an extraordinary weapon for its time. Firing 50 caliber ammunition at 750 rounds per minute, it could destroy or damage an attacking fighter at ranges exceeding half a mile. The ammunition came in multiple types. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the light armor on Japanese fighters. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined penetration with fire-starting capability. Tracer rounds allowed gunners to observe their fire and make corrections. Each type was color-coded by the paint on the bullet tip. Red indicated tracer, Blue indicated incendiary. Silver indicated armor-piercing incendiary. Black indicated plain armor-piercing. By mid-1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating against the small number of B-17 seconds in the Pacific theater had developed a healthy respect bordering on fear of the flying fortress. At the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, when B-17 seconds from Midway Atoll attacked the Japanese carrier force, Zero fighters attempted to intercept them at altitude. The engagement was brief and instructive. At 20,000 feet, the Zero's performance dropped off markedly. Their engines, optimized for low and medium altitude operations, struggled to develop power in the thin air. Maneuverability decreased. Climb rate became sluggish. The B-17 seconds, operating well within their performance envelope at that altitude, maintained formation and defensive fire discipline. The Zero's weapons had little effect against the bomber's armor and structural strength. Meanwhile, the B-17 seconds' defensive firepower was quite formidable at that range. Several Zeros made attacking passes, but the concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers forced early breakaways and made accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The Japanese pilots quickly assessed the situation and withdrew, allowing the B-17 seconds to complete their bomb runs unmolested. Though the high-altitude bombing proved ineffective against maneuvering ships, scoring no hits despite dropping over 320 bombs, the defensive capabilities of the fortresses made a lasting impression on Japanese airmen. The tactical reality facing Japanese fighter pilots in mid-1942 was becoming increasingly clear through hard-won combat experience. The B-17 Flying Fortress could not be treated like other Allied bombers. Where Japanese pilots had found success attacking British and Dutch bombers with light defensive armament, the American heavy bomber demanded entirely different tactics. Traditional stern attacks that worked against lightly armed opponents proved suicidal against fortresses. The tail gunner position, combined with waist guns and ball turret coverage, created an overlapping field of fire that extended over 3,000 feet behind the aircraft. Any fighter attempting a conventional rear approach had to fly through this wall of defensive fire for several seconds while closing to effective cannon range. The closing speed mathematics were brutally simple. B-17 E cruised at approximately 180 miles per hour. An A-6M0 attacking at full speed approached at roughly 320 miles per hour. Combined, this created a closing speed of 500 miles per hour, or approximately 730 feet per second. At these speeds, Japanese pilots had perhaps 3 to 4 seconds from the time they entered effective firing range until they had to break away to avoid collision or overshoot. During those critical seconds, they faced sustained fire from multiple 50-caliber machine guns, each capable of firing over 12 rounds per second. The mathematical probability of taking hits during an attack run was extremely high. Japanese pilots began experimenting with alternative tactics. High-side attacks from above offered some advantages, diving through the formation at high speed to minimize exposure time. But the B-17's dorsal turret and radio operator's gun covered this approach effectively. Low attacks from below seemed promising until pilots encountered the ball turret, which could track targets through 360 degrees and engage from angles impossible for fixed or limited traverse guns. Frontal attacks offered the best opportunity to avoid the heaviest defensive fire, but required exceptional skill and steel nerves. The closing speed during a head-on attack exceeded 600 miles per hour. Japanese pilots had approximately 2 seconds of firing time before having to break away to avoid collision. In those 2 seconds, they had to aim accurately while flying at full throttle toward an oncoming bomber, compensate for the extreme closing rate, place their fire precisely on the cockpit or engines, and then execute a violent brake maneuver to avoid hitting the target. Meanwhile, the B-17's nose guns, though fewer in number than rear defenses, were still 50-caliber weapons capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on the lightly built Zero. The fundamental problem was one of design philosophy meeting operational reality. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 had been designed to maximize range, speed, and maneuverability by eliminating every possible gram of unnecessary weight. The fighter carried no armor protection for the pilot. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing. The airframe was built as lightly as possible while maintaining structural integrity. This approach created an aircraft with extraordinary performance characteristics. The Zero could outturn virtually any opponent. Its range exceeded that of contemporary fighters by hundreds of miles. In the hands of well-trained pilots, it had dominated the skies over China, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Netherlands East Indies. But these same design choices that made the Zero supreme in fighter versus fighter combat made it extremely vulnerable to defensive fire from heavy bombers. A single 50 caliber bullet striking a Zero's fuel tank would often result in immediate catastrophic fire. Hits to the unprotected cockpit killed or wounded pilots instantly. The lightweight airframe could be torn apart by sustained heavy machine gun fire. Japanese pilots flying against B-17 seconds faced a terrible choice. They could press their attacks home, accepting high probability of being hit by defensive fire that would likely prove fatal. Or they could break away early, reducing their exposure but also reducing their chance of scoring decisive hits on the bomber. Most chose a middle path, making quick attacking passes and breaking away before sustaining critical damage. This reduced the effectiveness of their fire but kept them alive to fight another day. By August 1942, as the campaign for Guadalcanal intensified, Japanese commanders in the South Pacific were scratching their heads over the same tactical problem that would later challenge the Luftwaffe in Europe. Their fighters were being cut to pieces by the defensive guns of American heavy bombers. They had no aircraft optimized for bomber interception, with heavy armament and armor protection. Their anti-aircraft artillery lacked the accuracy and firepower to reliably bring down high-altitude bombers. Meanwhile, the B-17 seconds of the 43rd Bombardment Group and other units continued operating against Japanese positions with a degree of impunity that frustrated commanders and demoralized troops. The defensive firepower that so impressed and frustrated Japanese pilots represented only part of the B-17's capability. The real revolution lay not in the individual aircraft, but in how multiple bombers could fly together to create mutually supporting fields of fire. In the European theater, this concept would evolve into the famous combat box formation. In the Pacific, where B-17 seconds operated in much smaller numbers and the vast distances involved prevented the massed formations seen over Germany, the principle remained the same. Bombers flying in close formation could concentrate their defensive fire to levels that made successful fighter attacks extremely difficult and dangerous. A formation of 12 B-17Es, flying in a compact group with proper spacing and altitude separation, presented attacking fighters with 108 heavy machine guns. These weapons were arranged in three-dimensional space to create overlapping fields of fire, covering every possible approach angle. The tail guns of one bomber could support aircraft flying ahead of it. Waist guns could engage fighters attacking neighboring aircraft. Ball turrets could cover low approaches from any direction. Top turrets could sweep the upper hemisphere. Any fighter attempting to attack this formation had to penetrate multiple layers of defensive fire from several aircraft simultaneously. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots cannot be overstated. Veterans who had dominated early air combat against poorly armed opponents now faced an adversary whose defensive capability exceeded their offensive weapons. The 50 caliber machine guns outranged their own 7.7mm guns by significant margins. Even the 20mm cannons, while deadly when they hit, required Japanese pilots to close to ranges where they themselves were exposed to concentrated defensive fire. The 8 seconds of cannon ammunition meant that pilots had to make every burst count. Miss with the first pass, and there might not be enough ammunition for a second effective attack. Intelligence reports from Japanese units operating against B-17 seconds throughout 1942 consistently emphasized the bomber's toughness and heavy defensive armament. Pilots reported multiple instances of Zeros being shot down or severely damaged by bomber defensive fire. They described watching cannon shells and machine gun bullets strike B-17 seconds repeatedly, with little visible effect. Engines would be hit and continue running. Portions of wing or fuselage would be shot away, yet the bomber maintained formation and completed its mission. The structural strength that so impressed Japanese engineers on the ground was proving its value in combat. One incident from the campaign in the Solomon Islands illustrates the B-17's remarkable survivability. A fortress from the 43rd Bombardment Group, returning from a raid on Japanese positions at Rabaul, was intercepted by multiple Zeros. The fighters pressed their attacks with determination, making repeated passes over several minutes. The B-17 sustained hits to 2 engines, the tail section, both wings, and the fuselage. One waist gunner was killed, another wounded. The ball turret gunner fired over 1,000 rounds, claiming at least 1 Zero damaged. Despite catastrophic-looking damage, the bomber reached its base in Australia and landed safely. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and shell holes. Both inboard engines had to be replaced. Major structural repairs were required to the tail and wings, yet the aircraft was flying combat missions again within 2 weeks. Japanese pilots witnessing such resilience developed what American intelligence officers would later term four-engine fear. The sight of a B-17 formation approaching created genuine anxiety even among veteran pilots. The knowledge that attacking meant flying through concentrated defensive fire that hits on the bomber might produce no visible result, that one's own aircraft could be destroyed by a single burst from a .50 caliber gun, all combined to make B-17 interception missions among the most dreaded assignments in Japanese fighter squadrons. The captured B-17 seconds that Japanese forces had salvaged and made flyable provided additional insight into the challenge facing their pilots. When Japanese test pilots flew the captured fortresses, they gained first-hand appreciation for the aircraft's capabilities. The handling was surprisingly gentle for such a large aircraft. The controls were well-balanced and responsive. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent. The turbo-supercharged engines delivered remarkable performance at altitude. But what most impressed the test pilots was the sense of security provided by the heavy defensive armament and armor protection. Sitting in the cockpit with armor plate behind and below, knowing that gunners throughout the aircraft were covering every approach, created a psychological advantage that Japanese bomber crews flying unarmored, lightly armed aircraft could never experience. The evaluations conducted by Japanese aeronautical engineers revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the B-17's design. Engineer Hisanojo Ozawa, working for Mitsubishi, dismissed the B-17E as merely modifications made to an old design that first flew in 1935. Yet even Ozawa admitted that the B-17 was based on an extremely good original design and that improvements had made it a first-line combat aircraft. Designer Shizuo Kikuhara, who created the Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, was impressed by the simplicity of the B-17's cockpit, considering the aircraft's size. He noted that American engineers had perfected the bomber's subsystems to such a degree that a minimum of controls were needed in the cockpit, aiding flight control and allowing the pilot to focus on other critical tasks during combat. The defensive armament particularly fascinated Japanese evaluators. They studied the turret mechanisms, noting the precision engineering and reliability of the powered mounts. They examined the ammunition feed systems. Impressed by their capacity and complexity, they test-fired the .50 caliber Browning guns, measuring their rate of fire, accuracy, and effective range. Every aspect of the evaluation reinforced the same conclusion. The Americans had created a bomber designed to survive in hostile airspace through overwhelming defensive firepower and robust construction. Japanese industry, struggling to produce sufficient aircraft with limited resources and industrial capacity, could not replicate this approach even if doctrine had supported it. The industrial disparity became increasingly apparent as 1942 progressed. American factories were producing B-17 seconds at rates that Japanese intelligence found difficult to believe. Boeing's Seattle plant alone could build dozens of bombers per month. Additional production lines at Douglas in Long Beach and Vega in Burbank multiplied output. By mid-1942, monthly B-17 production exceeded 100 aircraft. Japanese bomber production, constrained by limited industrial capacity, shortage of critical materials, and competing priorities, could not approach these numbers. The Americans could absorb combat losses and still increase the number of bombers in service. Japanese forces, fighting across the vast Pacific theater with finite resources, had to husband every aircraft carefully. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reality facing Japanese fighter pilots by late 1942 was stark. They were flying lightweight, unarmored fighters optimized for dogfighting against heavily armored bombers designed specifically to survive fighter attacks. Their standard tactics, developed against opponents with light defensive armament, were ineffective against B-17 seconds flying in formation. Pressing attacks home meant accepting casualties that Japanese training pipelines could not replace, but failing to attack meant allowing American bombers to strike Japanese positions with relative impunity. There was no good solution to this tactical dilemma. Japanese pilots did the best they could with the aircraft and tactics available to them. Some became specialists in bomber interception, developing techniques that improved their chances of survival while inflicting damage. Others avoided engaging B-17 seconds when possible, seeking easier targets. All understood that encountering a formation of flying fortresses meant facing concentrated firepower that exceeded anything else in their experience. The contrast with the situation Japanese pilots faced in other areas of the Pacific was striking. Against Marine F-4F Wildcats, though outclassed in many performance parameters, Japanese fighters held their own through superior maneuverability and experienced pilots. Against P-40 Warhawks in China and Burma, the Zero's advantages in turn rate and climb allowed skilled pilots to dictate engagement terms. But against B-17 seconds, there was no dictating terms. The bombers flew at altitudes where Zero performance degraded. They maintained formation discipline that concentrated defensive fire. They absorbed damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft and continued their missions. The peak period of B-17 operations in the Pacific extended from December 1941 through September 1942, when 168 fortresses represented the maximum number deployed in the theater. During these 9 months, Japanese fighter pilots learned hard lessons about American bomber capability and their own vulnerability to heavy defensive fire. The cost in men and aircraft was substantial on both sides. American bomber crews flying against Japanese positions suffered from mechanical failures, weather, navigational challenges, and of course enemy action. But the loss rates never approached the catastrophic levels that would characterize the unescorted bomber offensive over Germany in 1943. The B-17's defensive capability, combined with the lighter armament of Japanese fighters compared to their German counterparts, meant that American bomber crews in the Pacific faced dangerous but survivable odds. Japanese fighter units, meanwhile, learned to respect the flying fortress as an extraordinarily difficult target. Intelligence summaries from various Japanese air groups operating in the South Pacific consistently reported the same observations. The B-17 was the most feared and respected American aircraft during the early stage of the war in the Pacific. It could absorb incredible amounts of battle damage and still remain flying. Its defensive firepower was formidable, capable of destroying fighters at long range. Attacking B-17 formations required careful planning, numerical superiority, and willingness to accept casualties that might exceed the bombers damaged or destroyed. By mid-1943, the B-17 was being withdrawn from frontline Pacific service, not because it had failed, but because it was needed more urgently in Europe and because the longer-ranged B-24 Liberator better suited Pacific theater requirements. The vast distances between bases and targets in the Pacific demanded maximum range. The B-24, with its more efficient high-altitude laminar flow wing and larger fuel capacity, could reach targets the B-17 could not. American strategic planners decided that available B-17 production should support the growing bomber offensive against Germany, where shorter distances from English bases to German targets made the fortress's range adequate. The transition happened gradually throughout the first half of 1943. The 43rd Bombardment Group converted to B-24 seconds in early 1943. The 5th and 11th Bombardment Groups made the same transition by mid-year. The 7th Bombardment Group, operating in India against Japanese targets in Burma, completed its conversion shortly thereafter. By September 1943, the B-17 had been completely withdrawn from regular squadron service in the Pacific. A small number continued flying special missions, primarily search and rescue operations, where their legendary toughness and long range proved valuable for retrieving downed crews from remote areas. The legacy of the B-17's Pacific combat extended far beyond the relatively small number of bombers deployed and missions flown. The Flying Fortress established psychological patterns and tactical expectations that influenced the remainder of the Pacific Air War. Japanese fighter pilots, having learned to fear and respect the heavy defensive armament of American bombers, approached all subsequent bomber interceptions with caution. The casualties inflicted by defensive fire from B-17 seconds in 1942 created lasting institutional memory within Japanese fighter units. Pilots who survived encounters with fortresses passed those lessons to newer pilots. The four-engine bomber became synonymous with danger, with heavy firepower, with aircraft that could absorb punishment and survive. This psychological impact proved important as the war progressed. When B-24 Liberators replaced B-17 seconds in Pacific service, Japanese pilots initially treated them with the same respect accorded to fortresses. Though the B-24 had different performance characteristics, its heavy defensive armament of up to 10 50 caliber machine guns meant it posed similar threats. Later, when B-29 superfortresses began operating against Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands in late 1944, the psychological foundation had already been established. Japanese pilots knew that American heavy bombers were extraordinarily dangerous opponents, heavily armed and difficult to destroy. This knowledge, purchased with blood over 2 years of combat against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, colored every aspect of Japanese response to the B-29 offensive. The industrial lesson proved equally important and ultimately more devastating to Japanese war efforts. The captured B-17 seconds that Japanese engineers studied so carefully in 1942 demonstrated American industrial capabilities that Japan could never match. Every component of the flying fortress revealed sophisticated manufacturing techniques, quality materials, and precision engineering. The engines represented the product of decades of radial engine development by Wright and Pratt and Whitney. The turbo superchargers came from General Electric's extensive research into high-altitude power plant technology. The aluminum alloys used in the airframe drew on American metallurgical expertise and access to critical materials. The defensive armament represented America's long experience with automatic weapons design, beginning with John Browning's innovations in the early 20th century. Japanese industry could examine these components, understand their function, even attempt to replicate them, but achieving the same level of manufacturing precision, material quality, and system integration proved impossible with limited industrial capacity and resource constraints. The gap between understanding American technology and matching American production capacity was unbridgeable. By 1942, American aircraft production exceeded Japanese output by factors of 3 to 4. By 1943, the ratio had grown to 5 or 6 to 1. By 1944, American factories were producing more aircraft in a single month than Japan could manufacture in 6 months. The defensive firepower that made Japanese pilots respect and fear the B-17 was merely the visible manifestation of America's true weapon in the Pacific War. Behind those 50 caliber machine guns stood the arsenal of democracy operating at full mobilization. Factories in Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank built bombers by the dozen, then by the hundred. Plants across the Midwest produced the Wright Cyclone engines that powered them. Browning's facility in Vermont manufactured the thousands of machine guns needed to arm them. Ammunition manufacturers loaded millions of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Training facilities taught tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners to operate these complex machines. The entire economic and industrial might of the United States focused on producing the materials of war in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production capacity. Japanese commanders, studying intelligence reports on American bomber operations, understood this disparity intellectually, but struggled to grasp its full implications emotionally. How could any nation produce such sophisticated aircraft in such quantities while simultaneously fighting a two-front war across both the Atlantic and Pacific? The numbers seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Every month brought more American bombers to Pacific bases. Every month saw more raids against Japanese positions. The trend lines pointed in only one direction. The specific encounters between Japanese fighters and B-17 combat box formations in the Pacific were limited by circumstances. The combat box formations that would become famous over Germany, with 54 bombers flying in precisely coordinated defensive arrangements, were never seen in the Pacific theater. The distances involved, the smaller number of B-17 seconds available, and the nature of Pacific targets meant that American bomber operations typically involved smaller formations of 6 to 12 aircraft. Yet even these smaller groups demonstrated the fundamental principle of the combat box. Bombers flying in close formation with coordinated defensive fire were exponentially more difficult to attack successfully than isolated aircraft. The few instances where Japanese fighters intercepted multiple B-17 seconds flying in formation invariably resulted in the same outcome. The fighters made attacking passes, sometimes scoring hits, occasionally inflicting damage. The bombers maintained formation, their gunners engaging the attackers, forcing early breakaways. The fighters might claim damage to one or more bombers. The bombers typically all returned to base, some with battle damage requiring repair, but operational again within days. Fighter losses from defensive fire equaled or exceeded bomber losses to fighter attacks. The exchange rate favored the Americans. They could afford the losses. Japan could not. By the time the last B-17 seconds departed frontline Pacific service in late 1943, they had established a pattern that would define American strategic bombing for the remainder of the war. Heavy bombers, heavily armed for self-defense, flying in formations that concentrated their defensive firepower, could strike targets deep in enemy territory despite determined fighter opposition. The costs were substantial. Crews were lost. Aircraft were damaged or destroyed. But the missions continued. The targets were hit, and the cumulative effect wore down enemy capabilities while American industrial production grew stronger. The Japanese fighter pilots who had faced B-17 seconds in 1942 and early 1943 carried those experiences with them through the remainder of the war. They knew firsthand what concentrated .50 caliber fire could do to a lightweight fighter. They had watched comrades die attempting to intercept formations of heavy bombers. They understood that American bomber defensive firepower was not propaganda or exaggeration, but deadly reality. When the B-29 offensive began in late 1944, bringing even larger, higher-flying, more heavily armed bombers than the B-17, Japanese fighter pilots approached the interception missions with knowledge purchased through hard combat experience. The four-engine American bomber was the most dangerous opponent in their sky. The story ends where it began, 25,000 feet above the Pacific, where young men fought and died in machines that represented their nation's industrial capacity, strategic doctrine, and approach to warfare. The specific title that brought you to this story speaks of Japanese commanders intercepting B-17 combat box formations and facing 48 .50 caliber machine guns per bomber. The historical reality is more nuanced. The peak B-17E model carried 9 .50 caliber guns, not 48. The formal combat box formations with 54 bombers were primarily a European theater development. In the Pacific, B-17 seconds typically flew in smaller groups of 6 to 12 aircraft. But the fundamental truth remains valid. Japanese fighter pilots did face unprecedented defensive firepower from American heavy bombers. They did struggle to develop effective tactics against aircraft designed to absorb punishment and fight back with overwhelming gun armament. And they did recognize, through costly experience, that the B-17 Flying Fortress represented a completely different class of opponent than anything they had previously encountered. The numbers, when accurately stated, remain impressive enough without embellishment. 12 B-17Es flying in formation presented 108 heavy machine guns. 12 B-17Gs, which never saw significant Pacific service but became the standard model in Europe, carried 13 .50 caliber guns each for 156 total weapons. These were not theoretical numbers but practical reality. American gunners fired these weapons in combat. Japanese fighters were hit by the defensive fire. The bullets were real, the casualties were real, and the psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was profound and lasting. The development of American bomber defensive tactics, whether in the Pacific's smaller formations or Europe's massive combat boxes, represented a uniquely American approach to strategic air warfare. Where other nations might have abandoned daylight bombing after discovering its costs, American commanders engineered solutions. They analyzed loss patterns, studied German and Japanese fighter tactics, experimented with formations, and refined their approach based on combat experience. The solution required massive industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers. It required training infrastructure to teach crews to fly complex formations. It required organizational skill to coordinate operations across vast distances. Most of all, it required extraordinary courage from the young men who climbed into those bombers, knowing that despite all the defensive firepower, the armor protection, and the mutual support, they might not return. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.
March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin, Hauptmann Walter Oso banked his Fokker-Wulf 190 hard to port, the skeletal ruins of the Reichstag visible through broken clouds 6 miles below. For 3 years, he had defended German airspace with methodical precision, destroying 97 Allied aircraft and earning the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. But on this freezing morning over the Reich capital, OSO witnessed something that shattered every tactical assumption the Luftwaffe had constructed about American bomber operations. American fighter aircraft circled the skies above Berlin at combat altitude, not the twin-tailed lightnings that occasionally penetrated this far with maximum fuel loads and prayer. These were different. Sleeker, faster, more numerous. Single-engine fighters with distinctive bubble canopies and laminar flow wings, escorting a formation of 75 B-17 flying fortresses directly over the heart of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. Impossible, OSO muttered into his oxygen mask, condensation freezing immediately against the rubber. His ground controllers had briefed him that morning with absolute certainty. American single-engine fighters lacked the range to reach Berlin. The distances were mathematically insurmountable. 560 miles from England to the German capital, 1,120 miles round trip. 5 hours minimum flying time. Fuel consumption calculations proved conclusively that no American single-engine fighter possessed sufficient range for such missions. Yet there they were. 96 Silver aircraft maintaining formation discipline at 25,000 feet, engines running smoothly after crossing the North Sea, traversing occupied Holland, penetrating 300 miles into German airspace, and still possessing sufficient fuel reserves for combat and the return journey home. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of what OSO witnessed were rewriting the strategic calculus of the air war over Europe. The North American P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard Merlin V1657 engine producing 1,695 horsepower and equipped with revolutionary external drop tank technology, had just destroyed the Luftwaffe's most important defensive advantage. The psychological impact on German pilots would prove more devastating than any tactical defeat. Their sanctuary had been breached. The deepest targets in the Reich now lay vulnerable to American fighter escort. The crisis had been building since August 17, 1943, when the 8th Air Force launched coordinated deep penetration raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The American bombers flew without escort beyond the limited range of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. German fighters attacked with devastating effectiveness. 60 bombers failed to return from a force of 376. Nearly 600 American airmen died, were captured, or went missing in a single day. The disaster repeated itself on October 14, 1943, remembered by 8th Air Force crews as Black Thursday. Another attack on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories. Another massacre. 60 B-17s shot down. Another 594 airmen lost. The casualty rate approached 20%. At such losses, no military force could sustain operations. American commanders suspended deep penetration bombing raids into Germany until a solution materialized. The Luftwaffe had won a decisive tactical victory that autumn. German fighter pilots had proven beyond question that unescorted daylight bombing deep into Reich territory was operationally impossible. The heavily armed flying fortresses, designed with overlapping defensive fields of fire and protected by armor plate, could not defend themselves against determined fighter attack. The entire strategic bombing doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces stood discredited by German bullets and cannon shells. But American industrial capacity was already producing the aircraft that would transform the air war completely. The solution emerged not from strategic planning committees or tactical doctrine schools, but from an unlikely marriage of British engine technology and American airframe design that had begun 3 years earlier in April 1940, when the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation with an urgent request. The British needed fighters. The Battle of Britain had demonstrated that Hurricane and Spitfire production could not meet operational requirements. The RAF sought to purchase Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, manufactured under license by North American Aviation. Dutch Kindelberger, North American's president, countered with an audacious proposal. His company would design and deliver a completely new fighter aircraft superior to the P-40 in every performance category within 120 days. The British accepted. North American engineers worked with unprecedented speed. On October 26, 1940, exactly 117 days after contract signing, the prototype NA-73 lifted off from Mines Field in Los Angeles for its maiden flight. The aircraft incorporated advanced aerodynamic features, including a laminar flow wing design that reduced drag substantially compared to conventional airfoils. Test pilots reported exceptional handling characteristics and impressive low-altitude performance. But the Allison V-17-10 engine that powered early Mustang variants suffered from inadequate high-altitude performance. The engine's single-stage supercharger could not maintain power output above 15,000 feet. As bomber operations shifted to higher altitudes where German fighters operated most effectively, the Allison-powered Mustang proved unsuitable for escort duties despite its impressive range and handling qualities. The breakthrough came from Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot who evaluated the Mustang at Royal Air Force Duxford in April 1942. Harker immediately recognized that the exceptional airframe was hobbled by an inadequate engine. He recommended fitting the aircraft with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine featuring a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output to 30,000 feet and above. British engineers converted 5 Mustangs to Merlin power. Flight testing in October 1942 revealed astonishing results. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling increased to 41,900 feet. Most critically, the aircraft maintained excellent performance throughout the altitude range where bomber escort operations occurred. North American aviation quickly adopted the Merlin engine for American production. Packard Motor Company manufactured the Rolls-Royce engine under license in the United States as the V-1657. By summer 1943, P-51B models powered by Packard Merlins were rolling off North American assembly lines at plants in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas at increasing rates. The P-51B incorporated internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons in fuselage and wing tanks. An additional 85-gallon fuselage tank could be installed behind the pilot, though this created dangerous center of gravity issues when fully loaded. The real breakthrough came with external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings. 2 110-gallon pressed aluminum drop tanks extended the Mustang's combat radius to over 850 miles. Total range with careful fuel management approached 1,650 miles. Just sufficient to escort bombers from England to Berlin and return with reserves for combat and emergency. The drop tanks could be jettisoned before engaging enemy fighters, eliminating their weight and drag penalties. American factories manufactured drop tanks with remarkable efficiency. Each expendable fuel container cost approximately $15 to produce. The same industrial capacity that mass-produced automobiles before the war now generated tens of thousands of drop tanks monthly. For the price of a single fighter aircraft, American industry could supply drop tanks for an entire squadron's operations for months. German industry possessed no equivalent capability. Luftwaffe fighters were designed for shorter-range interception missions defending Reich territory. German drop tanks remained scarce, poorly manufactured, and rarely used in operational service. Japanese fighters employed drop tanks extensively in the Pacific theater, demonstrating the technology's effectiveness, but German tactical doctrine and industrial priorities had not emphasized long-range fighter operations. The first P-51 equipped fighter group to reach Europe was the 354th Fighter Group, receiving aircraft in November 1943. Although officially assigned to the 9th Air Force supporting tactical operations, the 8th Air Force immediately requisitioned the unit for strategic bomber escort duties. The need was desperate. The losses from unescorted deep penetration raids had created a strategic crisis that threatened the entire daylight bombing campaign. The 354th flew its first mission on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over France. Initial escort missions followed quickly. Amiens on December 5th, Emden on December 11th, then Kiel on December 13th, the most significant early operation. The formation penetrated 480 miles into German airspace, forcing the Luftwaffe to respond in strength. The Mustang's long range had begun to alter the tactical equation fundamentally, but the real shock came in late February and early March 1944. By then, additional P-51 groups had arrived in England and completed conversion training. The 4th Fighter Group, stationed at Debden, 40 miles north of London, received Mustangs on February 28, 1944. Some pilots took off with less than 1 hour checkout time in the new aircraft. The operational urgency was that severe. 4 days later, on March 4, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group escorted B-17s and B-24s to Berlin. The first time single-engine American fighters had made the 1,100-mile round trip. German ground controllers initially refused to believe the reports. The defending pilots insisted they had encountered single-engine American fighters over the Reich capital. Intelligence officers demanded verification. The presence of such aircraft at that distance from any Allied airfield violated all known technical specifications and operational assumptions. The following missions confirmed the impossible had become routine. March 6th, back to Berlin. 17 Luftwaffe fighters shot down. March 8th, Berlin again. The American bomber streams now penetrated German airspace with continuous fighter escort throughout their entire mission profile. The short-range P-47s and P-38s still provided initial escort during climb-out and assembly, but when those fighters reached their fuel limits and turned for home, the Mustangs seamlessly assumed protection, staying with the bombers all the way to target and back to the North Sea before handing off to the shorter-range fighters again. The layered escort system provided continuous coverage throughout the mission. German fighters could no longer simply wait for Allied escorts to reach their range limits before attacking bomber formations. The Mustangs possessed sufficient endurance to maintain station with the bombers throughout their entire mission profile, engaging any German fighters that attempted interception. Major General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, implemented tactical changes that magnified the Mustang's impact. Previously, fighter escorts remained in close formation with bomber streams, providing defensive coverage but limiting offensive opportunities. Doolittle authorized escort fighters to leave the bombers when tactically advantageous to pursue and destroy German fighters before they could organize effective attacks. The new doctrine transformed the air war fundamentally. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack bomber formations, American escorts aggressively hunted Luftwaffe aircraft throughout German airspace. The objective shifted from simply protecting bombers to achieving complete air superiority by destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force wherever it could be found, whether in the air or on the ground. The campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe intensified during Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944. Operation Argument, as the offensive was formally designated, targeted German aircraft production facilities, engine plants, and ball-bearing factories with overwhelming force. Over 3,000 bomber sorties supported by extensive fighter escort struck industrial targets throughout the Reich. The American forces lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters during Big Week operations. Significant casualties demonstrating that German defenses remained dangerous and effective. But the Luftwaffe lost 290 fighters destroyed and another 90 damaged. More critically, the German fighter force lost 17% of its experienced pilots. Nearly 100 irreplaceable combat veterans killed in a single week of intensive operations. The exchange rate demonstrated that wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side that can replace losses more effectively. American aircraft production substantially exceeded losses. Pilot training programs graduated sufficient replacement aviators to maintain squadron strength. The industrial and training infrastructure supporting American air operations proved adequate to sustain the bombing campaign indefinitely, despite continued casualties. German aircraft production actually increased during 1944, despite Allied bombing, but replacement pilots could not be trained quickly enough to compensate for combat losses. Training time was reduced drastically in desperate attempts to maintain squadron strength. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flying hours and inadequate combat preparation. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to reinforce homeland defense often survived only days against the combined weight of American fighter strength and tactical skill. The fuel situation compounded German difficulties severely. Allied bombing targeted petroleum production and distribution infrastructure with increasing effectiveness. Refined aviation gasoline became progressively scarcer. Training flights were curtailed to conserve fuel. Combat operations were restricted by fuel availability rather than aircraft or pilot availability. The Luftwaffe possessed fighters. It lacked the fuel to fly them and the trained pilots to operate them effectively. For Hauptmann Walter Oesau, circling above Berlin that March morning in 1944, the presence of American Mustangs over the Reich capital represented strategic defeat. The Luftwaffe could no longer effectively defend German airspace against American daylight bombing operations. The sanctuary of distance had been eliminated by American engineering and industrial capability. Oesau continued fighting with the professional competence that had earned him Knight's Cross recognition. But 3 months later, on May 11, 1944, his Focke-Wulf 190 was shot down during combat with American fighters near St. Vith, Belgium. Oesau was killed instantly. He had survived 3 years of intensive air combat, only to fall to the overwhelming numerical and technical superiority that the Mustang represented. The Mustang's impact extended well beyond its impressive technical specifications. The aircraft enabled a fundamental shift in Allied strategic bombing doctrine that ultimately proved decisive in achieving air supremacy over Europe. With reliable long-range escort available, American bomber formations could strike any target within Germany with acceptable loss rates. German industry could no longer operate safely beyond Allied fighter range. The entire industrial infrastructure supporting the German war effort became vulnerable to systematic destruction. The transformation in bomber loss rates told the strategic story with brutal clarity. In October 1943, before Mustang escorts became available in significant numbers, 9.1% of 8th Air Force bomber sorties credited with attacking their targets failed to return. An additional 45.6% sustained damage requiring repairs. At such attrition rates, bomber crews faced mathematical certainty of death or capture before completing their required tour of 25 missions. By February 1944, with P-51 escorts providing comprehensive coverage, the loss rate dropped to 3.5% with 29.9% damaged. Still dangerous. Still requiring immense courage from every crew member climbing into a B-17 for another mission over Germany. But operationally sustainable, the strategic bombing campaign could continue indefinitely at these casualty levels, while German fighter forces were systematically destroyed in their attempts to stop it. The tactical advantages the Mustang provided went beyond simple range calculations. The aircraft possessed exceptional performance characteristics throughout its operational envelope. Maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet gave Mustang pilots the ability to engage or disengage from combat at will against most German fighter types. The Luftwaffe's premier fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, could match the Mustang's speed under certain conditions, but not consistently across all altitude ranges and tactical situations. The P-51's rate of climb was excellent. Maneuverability remained superb throughout the speed range. The aircraft could turn tightly at high speeds without excessive control forces. Pilots transitioning from other fighter types consistently praised the Mustang's harmonious handling characteristics that reduced workload and enabled effective combat maneuvering, even during extended missions when fatigue became a serious factor. 6. Browning 50 caliber machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. Each gun carried approximately 400 rounds, sufficient ammunition for sustained combat against multiple targets. The weapons were reliable, well positioned for convergence, and generated tremendous destructive power against both air and ground targets. Mustang pilots returning from escort missions frequently strafed German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and further depleting Luftwaffe strength. The ground attack capability proved particularly valuable during the intensive airfield strafing campaign that intensified throughout spring 1944. Mustang groups systematically attacked Luftwaffe bases across Germany and occupied territories. The attacks destroyed hundreds of German aircraft on the ground, killed experienced pilots during takeoff and landing, and forced the Luftwaffe to disperse operations to smaller, less efficient airfields, with inadequate maintenance facilities and supply infrastructure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustang-equipped American fighter groups carried vivid memories of technological and tactical superiority that fundamentally altered their assessment of Germany's strategic position. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot with 33 confirmed victories, recorded his reaction to encountering Mustangs in his combat diary. The American fighters possessed speed advantages that enabled them to control engagement geometry completely. German fighters could not escape when outnumbered. They could not pursue damaged bombers without exposing themselves to devastating counterattack. The psychological impact of fighting an opponent with overwhelming advantages in numbers, performance, fuel supply, and pilot training created a cumulative demoralization that eroded German fighter effectiveness beyond simple casualty statistics. Young replacement pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal training and faced immediate combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. Survival rates for inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots decreased dramatically throughout 1944 as American fighter strength increased and tactical proficiency improved through continuous combat experience. The captured aircraft testing program that had evaluated Lieutenant Thomas Fraser's Mustang at Rechlin provided German intelligence with comprehensive technical data about P-51 capabilities. Engineers created detailed performance reports documenting speed, climb rate, range, handling characteristics, and systems reliability under controlled test conditions. The findings circulated among Luftwaffe leadership, aircraft designers, tactical planning staffs. The reports confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting from actual engagements. The Mustang possessed decisive performance advantages in the most critical categories for strategic bomber escort operations. The systematic analysis highlighted the aircraft's exceptional range that enabled deep penetration missions, superior high-altitude performance from the two-stage supercharged engine, high maximum speed throughout the altitude envelope, and excellent handling characteristics that reduced pilot fatigue during extended missions. German engineers documented specific design features that contributed to observed Mustang capabilities. The aerodynamically efficient laminar flow wing reduced drag substantially compared to conventional wing profiles. The powerful Packard Merlin engine with sophisticated two-stage supercharging maintained power output to very high altitudes. Large internal fuel capacity, supplemented by external drop tanks, provided unprecedented range for a single-engine fighter. Thoughtful systems integration throughout the aircraft enhanced reliability and maintainability under operational conditions. The technical intelligence gathered through captured aircraft testing supported conclusions that existing German fighter designs required substantial improvements to remain competitive with current Allied types. Several ambitious fighter development programs were initiated during 1944 specifically to counter Allied air superiority through advanced technology. The Focke-Wulf 190D model incorporated an inline Junkers Jumo 213 engine for improved high-altitude performance compared to the radial-engined 190A variants. The Focke-Wulf TAR-152 represented a specialized high-altitude fighter optimized for bomber interception at extreme altitudes. Various revolutionary jet and rocket-powered designs promised performance substantially exceeding any piston-engine fighter in service or development. These programs reflected clear recognition among German designers and military leaders that existing Luftwaffe fighters could not effectively counter advanced Allied aircraft like the P-51 Mustang given the performance gaps in critical operational areas. However, severe material shortages, production delays caused by Allied bombing campaigns, and the rapidly deteriorating overall war situation prevented these advanced designs from entering operational service in numbers sufficient to influence strategic outcomes or reverse Allied air superiority. The jet-powered Messerschmitt Me 262 represented Germany's most successful attempt to leapfrog Allied piston-engine fighter performance through revolutionary turbojet technology. The Me 262 possessed substantial speed advantages that made it extremely deadly against Allied bombers when flown by skilled pilots who understood how to exploit its capabilities. Maximum speed approached 540 miles per hour, far faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter could achieve. However, the type suffered from chronic engine reliability problems that limited operational availability dramatically. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines required complete overhaul after approximately 10 hours of operation. Many engines failed well before reaching even that limited service life. The Me 262 required extensive concrete runways that were vulnerable to Allied attack and could not be easily concealed or dispersed. The aircraft consumed vast quantities of increasingly scarce aviation fuel, and it arrived too late and in far too small numbers to alter strategic outcomes or seriously threaten Allied air supremacy over Europe. Even the Me 262's impressive technological advantages proved strategically insufficient to overcome overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and the Luftwaffe's collapsing infrastructure, fuel supplies, and pilot training programs. Germany possessed innovative aircraft designs and brave pilots, but the nation lacked the industrial capacity, resource availability, and strategic depth necessary to compete effectively against the combined Allied war machine that included American industrial production, British technological innovation, and Soviet manpower reserves. The final year of World War II in Europe witnessed the Luftwaffe's systematic dissolution as an effective fighting force capable of meaningful resistance. Catastrophic pilot losses exceeded replacement capacity. Severe and worsening fuel shortages grounded aircraft regardless of availability. Production difficulties caused by Allied bombing disrupted manufacturing, even as output increased numerically. Overwhelming Allied numerical superiority rendered tactical skill and individual courage strategically irrelevant. The captured aircraft testing program continued operating as long as practically possible, attempting to provide tactical intelligence that might improve German pilot survivability, even as strategic outcomes became inevitable and final defeat approached. German test pilots who had flown captured Mustangs extensively and understood Allied aircraft capabilities, faced the war's end with complex and conflicted emotions. Professional aviators appreciated the engineering achievements represented by aircraft like the P-51. Even while regretting their service on the losing side of history's most destructive war, many harbored no illusions about Germany's defeat being anything other than total and unconditional. Having witnessed firsthand the overwhelming material advantages Allied forces possessed in every dimension of military power, these pilots recognized that courage and skill alone could not overcome fundamental imbalances in industrial capacity and resource availability. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, provided perhaps the most candid German assessment of the Mustang's strategic impact during the post-war interrogation by Allied intelligence officers. Göring admitted that he was stunned by the first evidence that British and American fighters were flying over German soil for hours at a time. He stated that he was convinced deep bomber penetrations were possible only with long-range escort, and that the escort fighter capability came as a complete surprise to German strategic planning. Göring went further in his admission. He stated that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time in March 1944, he knew that the eventual results would be tragic. The man who had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever attack Berlin, or his name was Meyer, a common German surname implying such an event would never occur, was forced to confront the material reality of American engineering achievement and industrial capacity. The Reichsmarschall's statement about long-range fighters delivering a major strategic blow to German planning was remarkable for its candor. Göring credited the escort fighter, and particularly the P-51 Mustang, as one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. This professional acknowledgement from Germany's highest-ranking Air Force officer validated the strategic importance of the Mustang's appearance over Germany in late 1943 and early 1944. The admission illustrated how confronting uncomfortable realities sometimes requires direct personal experience that cannot be dismissed or explained away through propaganda or ideological assumptions. German intelligence officers had access to substantial information about Allied aircraft capabilities through various sources, but the psychological impact of seeing American fighters circling overhead deep in Reich territory, where they should not have been able to reach, according to all previous assumptions, forced a fundamental reassessment of Germany's strategic position. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had been effectively defeated as a strategic force capable of meaningful interference with Allied operations. German fighters made minimal appearance over Normandy beaches, despite the massive concentration of Allied shipping and ground forces vulnerable to air attack. The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient operational aircraft, trained pilots, and aviation fuel to mount effective resistance against the invasion forces. The transformation in the air war from October 1943 to June 1944 was staggering in its completeness. 8 months separated the Black Thursday disaster at Schweinfurt from the virtually unopposed Allied landings in France. The primary factor enabling that transformation was the P-51 Mustang's arrival in sufficient numbers with adequate range to escort bombers throughout their entire mission profile while engaging and destroying German fighters wherever they could be found. Mustang-equipped fighter groups achieved extraordinary combat records during 1944 and 1945. The 4th Fighter Group, first to receive P-51s in the 8th Air Force, destroyed over 1,000 German aircraft both in the air and on the ground by war's end. The 357th Fighter Group, which included ace pilot Bud Anderson, became legendary for its combat effectiveness and aggressive tactics. The 352nd Fighter Group produced numerous aces and consistently achieved high victory-to-loss ratios. The African-American pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails for their distinctive aircraft markings, flew Mustangs on bomber escort missions from Italian bases beginning in summer 1944. Despite facing racial discrimination and limited opportunities for command positions, these pilots distinguished themselves in combat, shooting down 111 enemy aircraft and earning numerous decorations for valor and professional competence. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained P-47 Thunderbolts, likely from unit pride given their excellent combat record with that aircraft type. The systematic conversion to Mustangs reflected clear recognition that the P-51 represented the most effective fighter available for strategic bomber escort operations. The Mustang's combat record speaks to its effectiveness with cold statistical precision. American P-51 pilots destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft during World War II, the highest total for any American fighter type in the European theater of operations. This achievement was particularly remarkable given that the P-51B and D models did not enter combat until late 1943, missing the first 18 months of American air operations over Europe. The aircraft served in every theater where American forces operated. While most famous for its bomber escort role over Europe, Mustangs also flew long-range missions in the Pacific, escorted B-29s to Japan from Iwo Jima, conducted ground attack operations in support of advancing Allied armies, and performed photographic reconnaissance gathering intelligence for tactical and strategic planning. Part 3. Final. The legacy of the Mustang's impact on World War II extends well beyond its impressive combat statistics and technical specifications. The aircraft fundamentally altered strategic bombing doctrine by proving that long-range fighter escort was not only possible, but operationally decisive. The principle that bombers require fighter escort for deep penetration missions became established doctrine that shaped post-war air power development and remains relevant in contemporary military aviation. The importance of aircraft performance, particularly speed and range, was demonstrated repeatedly during Mustang operations over Europe. Technical superiority in key performance parameters, provided tactical advantages that skilled pilots could exploit for decisive effect. The value of quality training became evident through combat exchange ratios that consistently favored American pilots flying Mustangs against German opponents in inferior aircraft or with inadequate training. The necessity of industrial capacity to sustain prolonged operations was confirmed beyond question. American factories produced over 15,000 Mustangs between 1940 and 1946. This industrial output enabled the 8th Air Force to equip entire fighter groups with P-51s despite continued combat losses. Germany could not match this production capacity while simultaneously maintaining tank, submarine, and artillery output required for ground and naval operations. The engineering excellence that created the Mustang reflected collaboration between British and American expertise. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, refined through years of development for Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, provided the power plant that transformed a good low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude escort. North American Aviation's advanced airframe design maximized the engine's potential through aerodynamic efficiency and intelligent systems integration. The marriage of British engine technology and American airframe design represented the type of Allied cooperation that characterized the broader war effort. Neither nation alone possessed all the capabilities necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. Combined, their complementary strengths proved overwhelming. The Mustang embodied this principle in aluminum, steel, and high-octane aviation gasoline. For the bomber crews who flew deep into Germany day after day, the Mustang represented hope and survival. B-17 and B-24 aircrews nicknamed the P-51 pilots their little friends. The affectionate term reflected genuine gratitude for the fighter pilots who escorted them through flak-filled skies and intercepted German fighters attempting to shoot them down. Many bomber crewmen survived the war specifically because Mustang pilots engaged German fighters before they could press home attacks on bomber formations. The relationship between bomber crews and escort pilots developed into mutual professional respect, built on shared danger and common purpose. Fighter pilots understood that their primary mission was enabling bombers to reach and destroy strategic targets. Bomber crews recognized that fighter pilots risked their lives daily to provide protection against overwhelming German fighter strength. This mutual dependence created bonds that lasted decades after the war ended. The human cost of the air war over Europe was staggering regardless of aircraft type or national affiliation. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 dead during World War II, more fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps sustained in all theaters combined. The RAF Bomber Command lost 55,000 aircrew during the strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of pilots and aircrew defending German airspace against Allied bombing operations. These casualties represented young men with families, dreams, and potential contributions to society that were never realized. The waste and tragedy of war affected all nations, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. The Mustang's effectiveness in destroying German fighters meant German pilots died in cockpits over their own homeland, while American pilots survived to return home. But survival came at psychological costs that many veterans carried throughout their lives. The bomber crews experienced particularly intense trauma, flying 30 or 35 missions in crowded, freezing, unpressurized aircraft, while German fighters attacked and flak exploded around them, created lasting psychological damage. Many crew members suffered from what was then called battle fatigue, and would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The survival rate for bomber crews improved substantially with Mustang escort, but combat remained terrifying and dangerous even with fighter protection. The ethical dimensions of strategic bombing remain controversial decades after World War II ended. The targeting of industrial facilities inevitably resulted in civilian casualties, despite efforts to bomb with precision. German civilians died in their homes and workplaces when Allied bombs missed their intended targets or when fires spread beyond industrial areas. The moral complexity of these operations troubles historians and philosophers to this day. The Mustang pilots who flew escort missions bore no direct responsibility for bombing target selection or civilian casualties. Their mission was protecting bomber crews and destroying German fighters. but they were participants in a strategic campaign that resulted in substantial civilian suffering alongside its military objectives. Many Mustang pilots wrestled with these ethical complexities during and after the war, recognizing that their individual actions contributed to broader consequences they could not fully control or comprehend while focused on immediate tactical situations. The post-war careers of Mustang pilots reflected the extraordinary training and experience they had gained during combat operations. Many continued in military service, flying jets in the newly independent United States Air Force and combat missions during the Korean War. Others returned to civilian life, becoming airline pilots, test pilots, aviation executives, and aerospace engineers. The skills they had developed flying Mustangs over Europe translated effectively to both military and civilian aviation careers. Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group, became a respected test pilot and retired as a full colonel from the Air Force. Anderson destroyed 16 and a quarter enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another on the ground. He survived the war despite flying some of the most dangerous missions over Germany and continued contributing to American aviation development for decades afterward. Chuck Yeager, who shot down his first German aircraft while flying a P-51, became the first person to exceed the speed of sound when he flew the Bell Zone research aircraft in October 1947. Yeager's combat experience in Mustangs provided the foundation for his legendary test pilot career that advanced supersonic and high-altitude flight development throughout the 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of other Mustang pilots made similar transitions from combat to peacetime service, applying the skills and discipline they had learned during the war to advancing aviation technology and capability. The P-51 created not just tactical advantages during World War II, but also trained a generation of aviators whose expertise shaped post-war military and civil aviation development. The Mustang remained in operational service long after World War II ended. The aircraft fought in the Korean War, providing close air support for ground forces and maintaining air superiority against North Korean and Chinese fighters until jet aircraft like the F-86 Sabre assumed that mission. Mustangs served in air forces around the world well into the 1950s. Some nations operated P-51s in counterinsurgency roles into the 1980s. Hundreds of Mustangs remain airworthy today, lovingly maintained by collectors and vintage aircraft organizations. Air show audiences regularly witness the distinctive sound of the Packard Merlin engine and the graceful lines of what many consider the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever built. These flying examples preserve tangible connection to the men who flew combat missions over Europe 8 decades ago and to the engineering achievement the Mustang represented. The story of the Mustang over Germany represents a decisive moment when technological innovation, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine converged to produce strategic results. The aircraft itself was exceptional, but the Mustang's impact derived equally from the industrial system that could produce thousands of examples, the training programs that prepared pilots to fly them effectively, the logistical infrastructure that kept them operational in forward bases, and the strategic vision that understood how to employ them for maximum effect. German pilots watching American fighters circle over Berlin in March 1944 understood immediately that their nation faced an opponent with overwhelming advantages in every dimension of modern warfare. The Mustangs overhead were not just fighters. They were symbols of American industrial might, technological capability, and strategic reach. They represented a level of resources and organization that Germany simply could not match while fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who collectively outmatched German capacity by orders of magnitude. The admission by Hermann Göring and other Luftwaffe leaders that the long-range escort fighter was one of the most decisive factors in Germany's defeat validates the strategic importance of the P-51 Mustang. This professional acknowledgement from experienced military officers who understood air power doctrine and strategic dynamics confirms that the Mustang's appearance over Germany fundamentally altered the course of the air war and contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe. For Hauptmann Walter Oeso, who witnessed those first Mustangs over Berlin and died 2 months later in combat against American fighters, The moment represented both a tactical crisis and a strategic revelation. His professional skill and personal courage could not overcome the CISO's fundamental imbalance between Germany's dwindling resources and America's expanding war machine. The Mustangs circling overhead demonstrated conclusively that Germany had challenged an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity, superior technology, and the strategic depth to sustain operations indefinitely, regardless of casualties or setbacks. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried memories of fighting against overwhelming odds in aircraft that grew progressively more obsolete, while fuel supplies dwindled, training standards collapsed, and experienced comrades died in numbers that could not be replaced. Many developed professional respect for the P-51 as a weapon system and for the American pilots who flew it effectively. This respect emerged from direct experience that could not be dismissed through propaganda or nationalist sentiment. The final accounting of the Mustangs' contribution to Allied victory in Europe can be measured through multiple metrics. 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed. Bomber loss rates reduced from operationally unsustainable to strategically acceptable levels. Complete air superiority achieved over Western Europe by June 1944, enabling successful invasion and liberation. The systematic destruction of German fighter forces through continuous combat that exhausted pilot reserves and fuel supplies. But perhaps the most important impact was psychological. The presence of American single-engine fighters over Berlin, accomplishing what German military planners had assured their pilots was impossible, shattered confidence in German technological superiority and strategic assessment. When your own experts prove wrong about fundamental capabilities of enemy weapons systems, when the impossible becomes routine, when every day brings fresh evidence of the opponent's advantages, hope dies. That death of hope, more than any tactical defeat, pushed Germany toward surrender. The men who flew Mustangs, from English bases to Berlin and back, accomplished missions that tested both human endurance and aircraft capability to their limits. They fought against determined enemies who possessed skill and courage, but lacked the resources and support to compete effectively. The combination of America's finest fighter aircraft flown by America's best-trained pilots against an enemy with obsolete equipment and desperate determination produced the outcome reflected in the statistics. American dominance complete. German resistance broken. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.